Good evening. I'm Dr. Hillary Justice, the Hemingway Specialist for the Ernest Hemingway Collection here at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of my colleagues, Warren Finch, Acting Director, and James Roth, Deputy Director of the Library and Museum, and Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, welcome and thank you for coming. We changed the weather just for you. And our welcome to those who are watching on our webcast as well. The Kennedy Library Forums would not be possible without the generous support of our underwriters, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media partners, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. It's my pleasure to give a special welcome to members of the Hemingway Council and the Friends of the Ernest Hemingway Collection, many of whom are with us in the audience this evening, and to invite all of you to consider joining the Friends to help support the work of preserving and promoting the works of the Nobel laureate here in our archives and worldwide. You'll find informational brochures at your seats. If you're interested in joining the Friends, please find me after the program, or any staff member will be happy to help you out. Tonight's schedule works like this. There will be a quiz later. We'll have about an hour's moderated discussion by our speakers, and then a question and answer period, so I'll ask that you please hold your questions until that time. We have microphones in the aisle, and I believe they will turn the lights up, and you can just go to the microphone and they'll take your questions in order. If anyone wants to ask a question but doesn't feel comfortable going to that microphone, flag me down. I'll get your question. I'll try not to garble it too badly, and I will ask it for you. The microphones really help the people watching on the internet hear audience questions. After the Q&A, we will be hosting a book signing in the Smith Hall lobby right through those doors. Our bookstore does have copies for sale. And finally, a reminder to everyone to please put your cell phones on silent. I'll give you 5 seconds to do that right now. It's a joy to welcome tonight's authors, James McGrath Morris, Steve Paul, and Dr. Verna Kale, who will be serving as our moderator. James McGrath Morris is an author of biographies and narrative nonfiction. In addition to the work he'll be focusing on tonight, The Ambulance Drivers, Hemingway, Dos Passos, and A Friendship Made and Lost in War, his several books include Eye on the Struggle, Ethel Payne, the First Lady of the Black Press, Pulitzer, A Life in Politics, Print and Power, and Jailhouse Journalism, which has to be my favorite book title ever. Sorry, Steve. The Fourth Estate Behind Bars. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, Morris spent a decade each in journalism, publishing, and secondary education. He is one of the founders and the former president of Biographers International organization. Please join me in welcoming Jamie McGrath Morris.
Thank you.
Steve Paul, a native of Boston, welcome home, recently retired after more than 40 years as a writer and editor at the Kansas City Star, the newspaper where, 100 years ago this month, a young Ernest Hemingway got his start, which story Steve tells in tonight's other featured book, Hemingway at 18. Steve is a former board member of the National Book Critics Circle, an active member of the International Hemingway Society, and co-editor of War and Ink, a collection of scholarly essays on Hemingway's early work and writings. He edited Kansas City Noir, a collection of contemporary crime fiction, and as writer and photographer, produced a book about Kansas City architecture. Please join me in welcoming Steve Paul. Finally, our moderator this evening is Dr. Verna Kale, Associate Editor of the Hemingway Letters Project and Assistant Research Professor at the Pennsylvania State University, from which she holds an MA and PhD in English. She is the author of Ernest Hemingway, a critical biography of Hemingway out of University of Chicago Press, the editor of Teaching Hemingway and Gender. She teaches Hemingway and gender too, very well, by the way, and has published articles and shorter pieces on Hemingway, periodical culture, and life writing. Welcome, Verna Kale.
Thank you, Hillary. And thank all of you for coming out, and Steve and Jamie for joining us for this conversation. Tonight, we're here to talk about two books that cover Hemingway's life when he was 18 years old. In fact, that's actually the title of Steve Paul's book, Hemingway at 18. Jamie's book spreads out a bit more to cover Hemingway and fellow ambulance driver John Dos Passos, and it goes a little bit further into the future than World War I. But tonight, we're looking at that pivotal time in Hemingway's life. Fresh out of high school, Hemingway took a job at the Kansas City Star, and there he was exposed to the seedy underbelly of American life. Much of it resonates with us today. Corrupt officials, narcotics abuse, cops shooting first and asking questions later, professional sports, movie stars, and of course, war. So the story goes, Hemingway wanted to enlist, but medical conditions kept him out of the military, so he signed on to be a Red Cross ambulance driver. Not long after his arrival in Italy, while volunteering with the rolling canteen service in the trenches along the Piave River, he was wounded severely by an exploding Austrian shell, and the rest is literary history. Tonight, we're going to talk to Steve and Jamie about these formative experiences. There's some overlap in their two books. Sometimes they even quote from the same sources, which is kind of interesting to see the different use that they make of those sources. And I'm hoping that tonight our conversation will let us have a closer look at this important time in Hemingway's life and maybe challenge what we think we know about the young Ernie Hemingway. So I've got some questions for our two guests to get us started, and then as Hillary mentioned, we will leave about 30 minutes at the end for your questions. So I want to actually start just a little bit before the war, and Steve, maybe you can get us started. Talk to us about Kansas City in 1918, and specifically the Kansas City Star. What was it like, and how was Hemingway able to show up fresh out of high school, no real writing experience, and get a job?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a good place to start, I think. But Kansas City, it was 1917 when Hemingway's what I refer to as his summer of indecision. He graduated high school in June in Oak Park, Illinois. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do in life. He didn't. College was not in his plans for various reasons. But he had a thing for writing. He'd done a little writing in high school. He'd done some journalism in high school. He met somebody who was influential in a decision to do newspaper work. But he also had an uncle who lived in Kansas City. His father's brother lived in Kansas City and happened to have gone to Oberlin College with a man who was a top editor at the Kansas City Star, and he kept telling him, I can get you a job in Kansas City. Hemingway took all summer to really decide that he would do that. His English teacher, his high school English teacher, had tried to get him hired in Chicago, and I think if Hemingway had had his druthers, he would have preferred to have stayed in Chicago, in the Chicago area. But they weren't hiring. Kansas City was, partly because older men were leaving to go to the war, and clearly there was a lot of turnover. And at the moment, and someone joked that the editors of the Star were looking for anybody who could wield a typewriter, which Hemingway apparently could. And so he did, his uncle got him that job, and just as Verna said, 100 years ago this month, mid-October 1917, he arrived in Kansas City, stepped into the newsroom, where he spent the next 6.5 months, the war looming the whole period. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but that's how he got started.
And in your book, and Jamie, you also use some of these materials, you quote from some of these articles that he wrote at that time, but it was the practice at the Star not to give bylines. Right. So how did you select the materials that you were going to use?
A lot of that research had been done as far back as the 1960s. Kansas City Star staffer, at least one reporter, dug deep into the library files and found what they believed were star stories written by Hemingway, partly because of other evidence, assignment sheet evidence, partly because of the stories that had come down about the beat he had for that time, including crime, including the General Hospital beat where he hung out in the emergency room looking for knife fight victims and that sort of thing. And then an early Hemingway scholar, Matthew Bruckley, put together a collection of stories believed to have been written by Hemingway. That was as far back as 1970. We've done research since. I think I found other stories likely to have been written by Hemingway. Nothing as necessarily as significant that had already been uncovered. But my main task in this research was not necessarily to look for new Hemingway material. It was to look for context and to read the paper of his day and to find things that may have shaped his outlook, may have kind of filled in the gaps of the college education he never had. And the Star at the time was a very literary paper. It had some great writers on it. It was interested in the world, and it covered the war day in and day out as things heated up in Europe. I write about a particular man who was a minister in Kansas City who went to Europe on a YMCA lecture tour and had arranged to write really long narrative features from the fronts, both in France and in Italy, which he sent back to the Star. The second half of that collection of material began the week that Hemingway arrived at the paper. And so I've surmised that Hemingway was following along with Burris Jenkins' essays, and it was kind of an easy leap to make. And so the influence of the war in the news was certainly rather major, and just the atmosphere in the newsroom. I mean, he and others write about, as things break in Europe over the next several months, I mean, people can't, get up from their desks in between stories and go to the wire machine to look at the ticker to catch the news as it comes in. There's a real strong interest in it, in the war. I've been on this book tour for the last couple of weeks, and unfailingly, I run into somebody who thinks, because they've read A Farewell to Arms, for example, that they know that Hemingway was wounded during the retreat at Caporetto, and in that part of northeastern Italy. And I've had to correct somebody just a couple of weeks ago up in Michigan, and said, no, I'd like to let you know that's a common myth. But actually, the retreat at Caporetto, which is the central military action of A Farewell to Arms, happened 1 week into Hemingway's apprenticeship in Kansas City, and it's page one news in the Kansas City Star. And so his first experience of Caporetto was reading it in the newspaper and following along as the Italian debacle was happening. And it wasn't until he was in Europe and began researching that novel by reading other accounts and doing interviews, reporting that war, to write about that experience that he never had.
Why did he decide to join the ambulance? And Jimmy, you have some sort of interesting ideas that I want to ask a little more specifically about, but just sort of globally, what at that time in his life, what would have appealed about the ambulance service?
Well, I think first a little background on the ambulance corps. If you recall, the United States didn't enter the war until 1917, and a volunteer ambulance corps was developed in Europe. And it was started originally by a group of people in Paris driving whatever they could to the front lines and bringing the French soldiers back to the American hospital. Today, we would describe this movement as going viral in the sense that Americans who were concerned about Europe felt it was something they could contribute to financially. Poets, for instance, raised money for their own ambulance brigade. And what makes Hemingway's experience interesting is that what the Corps comprised people completely different than Hemingway. Because in order to be in the ambulance corps, you needed to have money in order to pay your way over. This is a volunteer job. Secondly, you needed to know how to drive a car. And who knew how to drive a car in 14, 15, 16 were wealthy kids, because poor folks didn't have cars then. And it wasn't a bad idea that you could speak French since you were going to land in France. What I've just described to you are Harvard kids, Yale kids, you know, from these universities. And they contributed the bulk of these folks. They were all, I mean, the reason I paired Hemingway with Dos Passos, aside from his friendship, he's a real literary foil. They wanted, in a sense, to experience the war. Somewhat similarly to, I talked with some Vietnam veterans recently, to how a corps of writers went to Vietnam. There's an adrenaline thrill of being near the action. They didn't want to contribute to the action. John Dos Passos, a left-wing pacifist, didn't want to help the action, but he felt, like Hemingway, I believe, felt that this was the central event of their generation, and to miss it in any form and manner would be forever a mistake.
So Dos Passos, he was a pacifist from the beginning, but he was anxious to get over.
But it's a sense of writerly experience. You know, he wanted to be able to see it, and in order to write about it. Whereas, and Hemingway's motives, I think, are different. But so, in the fall, when the United States enters the war in 1917, the Red Cross group was all volunteers, all run outside the military. The military comes in and takes over the ambulance corps. And so the ambulance corps that Hemingway volunteers for is a different ambulance corps, but it still involves primarily people well, when I made a list of ambulance drivers, they were extraordinary people, and I concluded that's the key to success in the 20th century. My wife, who has a PhD, pointed out my research methods don't quite work that way. But the point is that these were people who were already destined to do extraordinary things. And so I was just reminded that a minor character in my book who shows up, Guy Lowell, turns out to be the man who designed the Museum of Fine Arts here, et cetera. And so Hemingway's contact with these people, for Dos Passos coming out of Harvard, was very normal. But when Hemingway joins the corps, he's now entering a different kind of group that he would have entered into had he not gone there.
So I'm kind of curious about one point, though. Hemingway, and we can kind of talk about his journalism. He sort of is well known to have embellished certain stories about himself. There's all kinds of examples, but we've always heard that Hemingway wanted to enlist, but he couldn't because his eyes were bad. And you kind of challenged that a little bit in your book.
Well, so. I should explain. I'm the odd duck here. I'm sitting next to two preeminent Hemingway scholars.
Well, I'm kind of odd too. I mean,
I'm totally normal. So.
And I'm much more like a journalist who's parachuted in with a notebook and asking lots of questions. So, and I like Steve, I'm a reporter who was raised with an editor who says, you know, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So I always had cynicism. And people with bad eyesight were getting into the military regularly.
And Hemingway was a really good shot. Like, we know this, right?
Yeah. So I really will defer to Steve, but I think this...
One important point is that in 1917, he's too young to enlist.
Correct, without his parents' permission.
And his father didn't want him. His father thought he was too young to enlist. In letters to his sister Marceline that fall, he keeps saying, I can't stay out of this.
These are the things we both quote,
The gold braid, what's that? The gold braid glory. Yeah. That's not why he's going into it.
And he's always talking about joining, he loves the Canadian fighting force, the greatest in the world, because he interviewed, there were military recruiters in Kansas City, and he did a lot of reporting about military recruiting. But one key, and supposedly he didn't pass the eye test, but, one key encounter was a friendship he made in Kansas City, which began a young man named Ted Brumback, who was the son of a prominent judge in Kansas City, and he had just come back from 5 months in the ambulance service in France, and I believe he was interviewed by Hemingway. Their first meeting was an interview in the newsroom. But even before that, he had sent a letter to his father about this action on the one scary night in France, and the Star published that letter. The Star covered him in a couple of local speeches. And around the time, as Ted and Hemingway are becoming friends, the news comes in that the Italians, that the Red Cross was looking for volunteers to go to Italy with the ambulance service. Right around that time, Ted Brumback writes yet one more very long narrative feature about a night in the ambulance in France, and it's really a great story. And I just have to imagine, Hemingway never acknowledged it in any way that I know of, but you just have to imagine, as the close friends they were, they talk about it. He gets to read it before it goes in print, whatever. The one remarkable thing about that story is that Brumback got something that Hemingway never got, which was his initials at the bottom of the thing, TBB, which was also kind of extraordinary because, an editor acknowledges this is pretty good. But so it's around that time that Hemingway determined, and I think, as Jamie was saying, he knew that could get him close to the action. One of the myths that I try to address, and you might have, I'm sure you have an opinion on this as well, is whether or not Hemingway actually drove an ambulance in Italy, and I don't think he did. He hung out in Kansas City with the ambulance surgeons. It was famously, an editor famously complained that he often disappeared riding on the back of an ambulance. When you couldn't find him in the newsroom, he was out doing that. So he had experience with ambulances in Kansas City on the streets, but I don't know that he ever drove one. There's one picture of him posed.
Yeah. And one of the things to back up that viewpoint is that driving an ambulance is not like getting a car from Alamo. These were terribly complicated vehicles to drive. Dos Passos went through weeks of training. You have a variety of levers that retard the spark. It's like an organ. You have several pedals down there. So somebody like Hemingway, arriving there, this is a real war. They wouldn't have necessarily said, grab this. And by the way, the two models they used were Fords and Fiats. And if you know what those acronyms stand for, Ford is fix or repair daily, and Fiat is fix all the time. These were nightmarish vehicles. So I think it bolsters his viewpoint that the bicycle was a more apt form of transportation.
And just practically speaking, Hemingway was only in Italy, with his section of the ambulance corps for about 2 weeks before he and he complains, it's too quiet, there's nothing going on here, I want to get to the action. And so when the opportunity comes up to volunteer for the rolling canteen service, which had been established near the Piave River, near the trench up there, Hemingway raised his hand and went up there. So there was no driving an ambulance there either. No. So he had a 2-week window where maybe he went out riding with somebody. I found in the Immovable Feast, I came back across this recently. He wrote something to Gertrude Stein. He remembered a conversation about how the ambulances had to be braked as they were going down the mountain, and the thing is written in such an odd way in that he doesn't say I put on the brakes. He said the things had to be braked. He doesn't say you put on the brakes, which he often used the second person to talk about himself in action, and so I read that as kind of another little speculative confirmation that it wasn't Hemingway behind the wheel. And I have a friend who's a curator at the National World War I Museum in Kansas City. And he gets really uptight about it. And Hemingway never drove an ambulance. So
it was kind of boring until it was horrific. Is that a fair assessment of what was life like for your typical, maybe not Hemingway, but for your typical ambulance driver at that time?
In my book, I pair these two people, and they had very different experiences. But Dos Passos' experience was different than Hemingway in the sense that and Hemingway, by his own admission, says of the two, he really saw the war. So Dos Passos describes what it's like to be an ambulance driver, and the first thing that happens is you pull up your ambulances behind the trenches. The trenches in France were filled with 18, 19-year-old, these are kids. And when they look behind them and see the ambulances lining up, they know the next morning they're going to be told to get up out of the trenches and walk towards a fuselage of German guns. Very few of them might survive. So the ambulance drivers alone, it's like just the outfits they wore meant they were treated differently. And secondly, the kind of horrors. I mean, they had to go and fill these ambulances with mangled kids. And Dos Passos describes going down these roads that have potholes from the shells, and every time the ambulance lurches, it is a chorus of pain coming from behind, and because their legs are partial. I mean, the descriptions are gruesome, to the point that at one point Dos Passos' job is to carry buckets of amputated limbs out of the operating room. And this is important because these two men are going to become friends, and they're going to share a war experience, but their war experience is very different. Hemingway, as we'll probably talk, is a very personal experience, having felt the war physically, whereas Dos Passos felt it emotionally and intellectually over a longer period of time.
I think to get back to Ted Brumback, Brumback describes in great detail this horrific night, picking up dead and dying Frenchmen and being shelled while driving on these corrugated roads, and so it wasn't as if Hemingway went into his experience in Italy not knowing that there was danger or not knowing that it could be really horrible.
Well, in some ways, I think he was going there
for that.
Please.
Exactly. But he didn't find it. Now, except for the very first experience when he gets off the train in Milan, and they're immediately sent out. His crew is immediately sent out to clean up body fragments. Following an explosion at a munitions plant. And any of you who've read The Natural History of the Dead, you know kind of the shape of that story. He writes about that there. So he had an immediate experience like that before being then assigned a couple days later to what was called the Schio Country Club, the section number 4. There were 5 sections established in that region below the Dolomites. And the section number 4 was relatively quiet, and they played baseball, and there was a babbling brook, and there was a town they walked into and drank. And yes, from time to time, somebody ran up the mountain in an ambulance and picked up some wounded. But again, there was not nearly enough action to keep Hemingway engaged.
Now, when he went and did this, awful task of picking pieces of people out of the fence, the barbed wire where they had been stuck, I mean, that's horrific. That's the baptism by fire. At the same time, he sends a postcard home.
Which we both say
having a wonderful time.
Having a wonderful time.
Three exclamation marks, by the way.
So
He was 18 years old,
Okay.
and he's playing as he often did. He writes for his audience, especially in letters. I mean, depending on who he's writing to. But and he also makes a reference in that postcard about just like at the old General Hospital, carrying bodies in, as if he carried bodies. So he's processing this as a relatively immature. Becoming an adult teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's this. I mean, the way I read it is it's this pursuit of the experience. Mm-hmm. Oh boy, I'm glad I'm in it. 3 more exclamation marks. And it's a removal. Now, part of it may, and you may be able to explain this. I was a journalist for years, and we refer to morgue humor in newspapers. And it's not disrespect for the dead, but if you come back to the newsroom after having covered a trucking accident in which the body parts are spread around, you use humor as a way to mitigate what you've seen. And it could well be, I mean, this is thinking on the stage, that Hemingway's reaction in that famous postcard is part of a way to immunize, to protect himself from, I mean, what he saw was gruesome. Munitions factories were all female, so he's picking up body parts and hair, and I mean, the description is awful. Whereas John Dos Passos, who was trying to be a poet, his visceral reaction was entirely different, and he didn't have that kind of more. So maybe the newsroom contributed to that. I never thought of that. I might have to do that in the paperback.
Yeah. I'm not going to challenge that.
Okay, good. Can I quote you? Can we have a few minutes so I can quote my experts?
Jamie, you write along those lines, in Hemingway's mind, war was inevitable and a man was measured by it as he had been. Literature could capture the experience, not change it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
The reason I thought the pairing between these two authors worked, and I'm going to focus on Hemingway, is that just like a literary foil in a Hemingway novel, you often learn a lot about the protagonist through what the other person's views. And in many ways, when you read the book, you're seeing Hemingway through Dos Passos' eyes, and you're seeing the contrast. And as I mentioned, Dos Passos was this left-wing radical kid coming out of Harvard who believed very much in a mutation of the Karl Marx quote, which is Karl Marx had said, philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world, the point is to change it. And he wanted to use his writing to end what he had seen in World War I. And that's the great division line, why they work well as a pair, is that Hemingway, by contrast, was much more wanting to represent what he saw in an artistic form. And it isn't until late in the maybe 36 or 37 that he begins to think about using writing to make a change.
Because the standard interpretation that you'll get in a high school class or an intro to lit class is, farewell to arms, sun also rises. This shows us the horrors of war.
Yeah,
and that doesn't really fit with the narrative.
It doesn't fit with me because I don't think they're anti-war novels. I have this argument with several people. My soundbite on this is that Hemingway got three things: that he thought war was inevitable, and that it tested your manliness, which is certainly a preoccupation of his. But the one I think, that I linked a lot to this, is, of course, it brought you the greatest reward. It brings you love, because that was the ultimate reward of his experience in Italy. And so I think forever the war is a three-part thing for him, which is different than John Dos Passos' view.
But the love which leads to tragedy.
He can't. Yeah, but that's because he's a classic tragic figure. His whether it's his mother or shell shock or whatever, it's something inside him is going to cause him to destroy everything that's valuable. But still, I think shells means Van Karowski, shells mean Martha Gellhorn, shells mean Marion. I think war is linked in a way. Not Hadley and Pauline.
But he didn't celebrate war. He was disillusioned by it, and his books, those books, seem to reflect that disillusion as well. You seem to disagree. There
are directors who make films about gangsters in the United States, and how you view them may have a lot to do with how you bring what you bring to the table. I tend to think that Hemingway's version of war is not intended to bring an end to it. I don't think that everyone enters. Yes, I realize it's negative, and some of the endings are really sad and all of that, but I still think it's a kind of inevitability of human life, and I want to represent it as opposed to I want to change it.
Good point. Yeah.
And novelists don't necessarily, I don't want to give novelists in the audience this burden of changing the world. I'm just saying that pairing, the reason I liked pairing these two guys is that rather than write an explicit sentence about Hemingway, you could see it through Dos Passos' eyes.
Well, looking at Hemingway that way almost makes him more of a modernist. A lot of times people are hesitant to call him a true modernist, but if he does have this sort of objective detachment, that fits in with that story. But at the same time, it also seems, just from the letters that you both quote, that he was, part of him was just sort of thrilled to be there, and just if there was something going on, he wanted to be in it, to the degree where he would sometimes sort of write himself into the story in ways that were maybe not completely historically accurate.
I think that's true.
So.
Yeah, I'm not saying this began in Kansas City, but I do kind of point and talk about two or three.
Let's go back to Kansas City.
Yeah.
The two stories you mentioned that really stood out for me. One is, because this one seems so much like his war stories, where he kind of there's this account of him helping a smallpox victim.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
And then there's also just this one that I just can't explain, where he tells his parents he's going to marry this movie star.
Yeah, Mae
what was,
Marsh.
what was happening with either of those?
I think that was a little Scotch, but anyway.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, so there's a famous story, and Ted Brumback is not always a reliable correspondent on this. Brumback wrote a piece for the Star 20 years later. It's kind of a memoir piece. He had left and gone to California. His father, like Hemingway's father, committed suicide, and they corresponded about that. They actually had a rather drunken meeting that Brumback, in 1928 in Kansas City, that Brumback ended up having to apologize for. But some years later, in the mid-30s, he comes back to Kansas City. He's in the real estate business, and he writes a piece for the Star, memories of Hemingway before A Farewell to Arms. Hemingway was a big star. And Brumback tells some of these stories about the war that we both draw on, but the one you mentioned about the smallpox victim, so part of Hemingway's beat from time to time was walking to the police station, walking up to the Union Station, which was a huge, gorgeous, fairly new train station in Kansas City, and he'd be looking for celebrities, or he'd talk to railroad cops, or looking for news there. And one day there was a man who was shaking and pustular, and people were surrounding him, and clearly he needed medical attention. And the mythical story is that Hemingway was the one who finally came by, saw this guy, nobody's helping him, and he yells at people, picks the guy up, takes him out to a waiting cab, and takes him to the General Hospital, which is really not that far away. The problem is that something that Hemingway also wrote about was that the hospital only had 3 ambulances, and most of the time 2 of them were in the shop, and so the ambulance response times were pretty bad. But when you read the news account and of this man who's fallen in Union Station, and the reporter, it's a really lousy story, but it's really hard to read, but the report of this action, one, never mentions Hemingway, never mentions a reporter picks this guy up and takes him out to a cab and takes him to the hospital, because eventually an ambulance does arrive, and a nurse and a doctor pick the guy up and take him to the hospital. So where does this Hemingway story come from? I have no idea, but he tells it on himself, and it was told in perpetuity.
And this is where Steve's microscopic work about that year is really interesting for me, because very often you're seeing the seeds of things I noticed later. And one of the connections I saw is Theodore Roosevelt would have been a very important person for Hemingway. But one of the things I think Hemingway picked up through osmosis, not like he was studying it, Theodore Roosevelt, we think about as our first media president. When he charged up San Juan, what did he do? He made sure reporters were along for the ride. He really used the media in that way. And I don't think it's an accident that when Hemingway comes back to the United States and comes off the boat, and reporters from the New York Evening World, is certainly a sensationalistic sheet at that point, are doing stories about him. Again, I think this is subconscious. I don't think like Hemingway said, oh, I need to plant a story about myself. But he never corrects them when they're wrong. And when he gets back home, when stories are told about him, he never corrects them where, these exaggerations. And I think what's going on, which you see really develop later in his life when he writes for Esquire, is a sense of creating a public writer's personality apart from you. In a sense, you're writing a novel about yourself that helps promote you as a novelist. And again, I don't want to say Hemingway did this purposefully and he was thinking of promotion, but there's something going on there, that the exaggerations aren't merely boasts and lies. I think they're part of a larger schematic about his life.
He kind of started to lose control of that fairly early on.
As those early news stories, and then later even his publisher, refers to his experience as being a lieutenant in the war as if he were, a soldier. And Hemingway didn't often correct people about that, and in fact wanted people to believe from time to time in that war, in the Spanish Civil War, in World War II. He wanted to be part of the action and got in trouble for it.
And when he realized that it was going to, those sort of fictional accounts were going to come out, he was a little sheepish about it. In the Hemingway letters, we find out that he starts kind of getting famous with Farewell to Arms, and he starts to kind of notice, like, oh, some of my stories that I've told maybe don't add up, and he got kind of mad about some of the publicity that was going to happen. But at the same time, I see what you mean. Like, he was just sort of, it was part of just the persona that he was creating.
In some ways he was insecure, and when he was surrounded by these Ivy Leaguers in Italy, for example, I mean, the one way to kind of, one way to get over that is to be boastful and to, try to fit in and to kind of overstate and to prove that I'm not some country bumpkin from Oak Park, Illinois, but in fact.
So why is it necessary to embellish on an already great story? Why do we have to add carrying the guy to safety after being shelled? Isn't being shelled enough?
What Verna was just talking about, that other story, is what happened after Hemingway was wounded. And the story, as Hemingway first told it, and then began to walk away from it, but Carlos Baker repeated the story in his first great biography. Did Hemingway, in fact, after being wounded, being unconscious, wakes up and picks a wounded Italian, puts him on his shoulder, and takes him to safety?
How many pieces of shrapnel? 200?
With 227 pieces of shrapnel and a bullet or two.
And a bullet
in his knee as he's walking.
And a concussion, probably.
Probably concussed. I suggest, and actually writers before me, I do acknowledge Steve Florczyk, who's a Hemingway scholar, did a great book on the Hemingway, the ambulance, the Red Cross service in this period. He, I think he agrees with me, or I agree with him. I read the Red Cross reports, which get increasingly less detailed about the supposed heroism that had accrued to Hemingway, and which he incurred at some point. But I don't think he carried the guy. Did he drag him? I found not too long ago a note towards the end of that year. It was in Italian, and I had a friend translate it, which basically said Hemingway was honored for not as ambulances came up to pick up some of the wounded after that experience. Hemingway said, "No, I'm okay for right now. Go get those guys. They need help." And so that, I think, was the incident that the Italians and the Red Cross service may have acknowledged as worthy of a medal. And because, as you read the Red Cross reports over those next few months, Hemingway gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the truth, I think, comes out.
There's a tangential puzzle, and I always bring this up, the 30-second thing I like to bring up in forums, is that in both of our books, we describe how there was an Italian soldier between the mortar and Hemingway. And had the Italian soldier not been there, we would not be having this forum tonight.
Sure.
And on the Piave River, there's a memorial to the fact that Hemingway was wounded there. And there's no mention of the name of the soldier who gave his life to make this man's life possible. And so with an Italian researcher, we got it down to 18 names, and I'm hoping, I always mention this because I'm hoping somebody will go to Italy and figure out which one of these men, because they shouldn't be forgotten. But I punted entirely. After reading everything, I couldn't figure out if he'd really dragged. So what I did instead is I was more interested in Hemingway's own perspective on what he did. So rather than recreate the scene, I recreate the scene in the hospital when he is recounting, and you start seeing the various versions. And I felt it was better for the reader to make up their mind than I was never going to get the answer.
Yeah, and again, I thought it was part of this theme of embellishment that interested me, and it comes up from time to time through that period.
Well, in discussions of Hemingway's literature that would follow, a really dominant thread for a long time was Philip Young and his idea of the wounding as Hemingway's, main event in his life, and how everything could sort of be traced back to that, and that it was this really just central experience. Trauma, we would call it post-traumatic stress now. Hemingway, I guess, would have called it shell shock. And that seems very likely. At the same time, when you read his letters home, they're ebullient. He seems happy. He's in love, like you were saying. He's having a grand time. So I'm wondering, what was sort of going on with him in the period after his wounding?
Well, a lot. Again, my book ends at his 19th birthday, roughly, although I project into the future and this failed love affair with Agnes Montgomery. A lot of things were going on that summer. He drank a lot in his hospital bed. I mean, he was in the hospital for the rest of the year, essentially. Certainly through the armistice. There was one moment in late October when he goes out to... thinking he can go out to a line in the mountains, and he comes down with jaundice and immediately is sent back to the hospital. But in some of those letters to his parents, it wasn't all upbeat. I mean, he did project the fact that he wanted to write, but he also talked about death and honor, and who were the real heroes. I'm not a hero. There are real heroes. Including the parents of the dead. And so, I mean, he was thinking about this stuff. I love the line in one of those letters towards the end of that year, 1918, when he said, "Does this sound like the crazy kid?" After doing this, this sort of philosophical assessment of death and how close he came to it, and whatever his experience might have been, does this sound like the crazy kid that you sent out in the world a year ago? I thought that was a rather fitting moment and a fitting line that, that at least worked to tie things up for me.
I don't think he suffered from what we call, what they called then, began to call shell shock. And I think you're right, because it's an attempt at a short story that's very macabre and involves suicide. I think, like anybody, a lot of time in a hospital bed gives you a lot of time to think. So I think what you're seeing is both, like the classic line about sending out the crazy kids, oh no, celebrating the parents. He's writing that to the parents, carrying fate. I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at it. I was struck by, and I talked to a number of Afghan and Iraq War veterans about his wound in a bigger sense. He won a really macabre lottery, is the way they viewed it. Because there are certain kinds of wounds that are almost good. I mean, you come home wounded without having lost your leg or something like that. He always has shrapnel in him. In a way, it's a beneficial wound. He's bringing back something from from the Great War that others aren't, and he's not going to be able to not do things, to use a double negative. He has his body parts together.
And it's significant then that in The Sun Also Rises, Jake Barnes, his wound is not insignificant.
I know.
He has been unmanned.
So we're never that direct.
When people want to write about, oh, Hemingway's just writing about himself, you look at his protagonists, and obviously Hemingway did not suffer from the same condition as
Not so
Barnes.
obvious. Again, those readers that I met on the road in the last few weeks, I mean, one question was about that. Well, didn't Hemingway suffer that wound in the,
Yeah.
And then Frederick Henry is also very different because it doesn't really fit with the idea of Hemingway as having wanted to be in the war and seeing it and kind of coming out, like you're saying, sort of relatively unscathed. Frederick Henry just sort of deserts, and that's also very different from what we saw, actually happening in Hemingway's real life.
Well, I think there's a danger with novelists that we want to trace every character's origins to something that either they experienced or saw, and we won't ever know where. He may have met a deserter, who knows? You know, his focus on this part of the anatomy is also part of him. I mean, when in the bromance, and I don't use that word in the book, by the way, the bromance between Dos Passos and Hemingway goes sour. This is often an area of attack that Hemingway uses. I mean, he talks about Dos Passos not being able to fulfill that function. So, you know, it's almost a high schoolish kind of, you know, puberty reaction or something. So I don't think he necessarily has to have a wound in order for his character in Sun Also Rises to have a wound. But of all the manly wounds to get, that's not a good one.
Not a terrible. And so, what was the difference between Hemingway's Homecoming and Dos Passos?
Dos Passos is animated with wanting to end the war. He writes a crappy novel that about the war, and then he writes a really good novel called Three Soldiers about the war, and people are buying it and reading him. So when he and Hemingway meet in 24, which was really fun for me, was that Hemingway at that point was the unknown at the table, and Dos Passos had a multi-book contract. But he was infused with, you know, he comes to Boston to work on Sacco and Vanzetti's behalf. He's still infused with change. And the thing that brings the two of them together is shop talk, just like Steve and I might talk about, you know, part of his book or the editor that I know or that kind of thing. But the difference that separated them and Dos Passos' frustration with Hemingway until the Spanish Civil War, is this sense of, you know, we got to do more than just write. The writing has to have social meaning, and that's what Dos Passos leaves the war with, whereas Hemingway is younger, more confused, developing this alter personality of untruths. And you know, in a sense, Sun Also Rises is a war book, but it's really not until Farewell to Arms. That's 10 years later that I think he works out the kinds of things that his friend Dos Passos got to work out in 23 and 22. So they're in different trajectories.
I read a really funny letter today upstairs in the research room. It was Dos Passos, sort of frustrated, giving Hemingway a little writerly advice. He's like, you know, don't ever write a trilogy. It's way too much work.
Yeah, no.
But it seemed, I mean, reading those letters between them, it seemed like they had a pretty amicable relationship, but they seemed pretty different.
Well, I think they had more than an amicable relationship in the sense that, you know, you mentioned Hemingway being insecure. You know, he writes to Max Perkins. He's waiting for Dos Passos to say what he thinks of the book. He doesn't care what the New York Times. I mean, he does care. We all care what the New York Times say. But I mean, they're very much dependent on each other in that sense. And the reason, and it really works well. If you guys read the books in order, read Steve's and mine, you'll find that there's something going on that's bigger than these men in many ways. Of that lost generation, these are the two who actually tasted and touched the war of these writers. And they were fundamentally convinced that the way of writing, the Edith Wharton style of writing, couldn't survive the fracture that had occurred with the Great War. And that's what binds these two together. They're really, you know, bound in a kind of literary revolution, and I think Dos Passos is less appreciated for the similar pursuit that he had.
Except when I first met Jamie, 4, 5, 6 months ago here in Boston, just so happens, I told him that I'm a real latecomer to Hemingway relative to many of my friends in the Hemingway world. But my first really great love in some ways was Dos Passos as a writer. And that modern, that sort of invention in the USA trilogy, for example, I don't think it holds up really anymore. But I was really moved by that book, not only by the passion of history and the labor movement and all that, all that conflict of the early 20th century, but I just love the experimentation, and it was probably more influential on me because of that, maybe unfortunately, in some people's minds. But I just thought, wow, this is really interesting, and this is really. I mean, I was in junior high school, I think, when I read when I read that trilogy. But I was, much more impressed by Dos Passos than Hemingway at that time.
And I think it tells you a lot about Hemingway, all of this stuff. I mean, to get back to our main guy, in that there's another book I'm working on, in which these two, my subject and this other person, were both mortar gunners in World War II. And I asked people if they talked about it. And they said no, they never talked about it. But it gave them an instant bond, an instant connection. And for Hemingway, Dos Passos gave him that instant connection, because they're both writers trying to work out whatever it is they saw. And he didn't have that with other people. And I think their actual phrases and things. I mean, this is a little tiny trivia, but in Sun Also Rises, there's a woman who appears in the early pages, and that's Dos Passos' girlfriend. And there's a merging all the time of these things. And so, if you really want to understand how Hemingway came out of the war, you have to understand what he and Dos Passos were doing. It isn't just the shells and the mortars and things that hit him. No.
Well, I think it's really interesting. You mentioned this earlier, but it was part of your book that really struck me was your appendix material, where you do say, there was a guy standing there in between Hemingway and that shell, and what might have happened. We don't even know his name, and you're really the first person I know who's tried very hard to find it out. So what would have, literature have looked like if that guy hadn't been in the way?
I don't mean to diminish Hemingway, but Hemingway, in a way, and God, if there are art critics in here, I'm going to be really in trouble. Hemingway is like the Picasso of the Cubist movement. He's not alone in doing these things. So we would have had a different group representing. I don't think the change in writing, I think a lot of it would have occurred here if he had lived. But part of the reason for this, and this is really appropriate speaking in a national archives, is that one of our sensibilities has changed so much. When I was working on a book about Joseph Pulitzer, I kept finding newspaper headlines in newspapers that said something like, "The Astors escaped the fire, but 3 Irish maids perish," making no mention of their names. And naming names is terribly important. And it just struck me, this is the business of being a journalist parachuting in. I looked through all of these books, and nobody seemed to think about, what was this guy's name? I just wanted to mention it. And I think that's an important part of our job as historians, is to somehow recognize the people whose sacrifices were made. And that's why I put in that appendix. Hopefully, and I did have a letter from somebody who's on their way to Rome, so maybe next year we'll be able to tell you.
Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant
I think it's time for us to move on to some questions from the audience. If there are some, I'm kind of blinded by the lights. So
we are all blind. Oh,
yeah,
that sounds right.
there are people.
There are people. Oh my goodness.
So
you don't know how blinded we are
in the middle of the aisles, and if you do not wish to get up, you can sort of wave, and we'll send someone over to hear your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, is there any evidence of some political epiphany or some seeds of his future political views in this year?
Political epiphany on
Sort of the early the seeds of his political leanings in this significant year.
Did he give any evidence?
Hemingway, you're saying?
Hemingway.
You're the 18-year-old expert.
Yeah,
I'll add my view.
I'm not sure I quite follow the question. Could you clarify exactly what you're asking?
Does he show any evidence in this, as a result of this experience, of having any kind of a political epiphany?
Okay. Not as early as Kansas City. And to follow up a point that Jamie was making earlier, Hemingway was aware of political corruption in Kansas City, which was reminded him of the old Smokeville on the Lake, meaning Chicago. I mean, he knew that politics could be corrupt, but it really didn't matter to him. It was not something that he embraced or was interested in all that much. He certainly didn't write about politics while he was in the Kansas City period. Later on, Dos Passos, was the more political animal in some ways. Hemingway, did not want to be a political writer. No. He was adamant about not writing polemics. And it got him in trouble a little bit in the literary marketplace in the 30s. People wanted him to be more, show his colors a little bit more. And I'm not sure he had the colors, although he got outraged, during that hurricane.
That's exactly it.
Yeah,
if you're looking for it, that's when
Yeah.
it occurs.
Yeah.
When the hurricane of 36,
35,
35,
I think, yeah.
and all these CCC workers die, and he's
And,
so-
it's significant that they were veterans.
Yeah,
they're
they were
veterans,
veterans.
And that's what
and he's really angry. But all the period before, he's constantly arguing with Dos Passos that politics has no role in this. He refuses the entreaties from Dos Passos to come to Boston and help. He really remains and part of the shift in the 30s is also keep in mind that if you weren't a left-winger, if you were an artist and you weren't a left-winger or a communist in the 30s, people would wonder what's wrong with you. I mean, there was enormous social pressure on Hemingway then, which didn't exist right after the war, because right after the war, there's a tremendous era of suppression, and you could stay aloof much more so than you could in the 30s.
But clearly during the Spanish Civil War, Hemingway's leaning seemed to be towards the left. I mean, his sympathies were with the leftists, and most of his journalistic perspective was from that side of the war, even though he wasn't overtly a political writer.
And that's what ticks Hemingway off so much. He comes to Spain, and I'm paraphrasing, he never says this directly, but it's like he said to Dos Passos, Dos, here I am, I'm a left-winger now. And Dos says, well, I'm not any longer, I'm moving away.
Yeah.
And it just really irritates him. So, sorry, we have another question.
Yes, please.
Good evening, everyone. I thank you guys. I thank you all for coming this evening and talk to us.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right. So, as well, no, I'm
You
a
might
little
need to
nervous.
move closer to the mic. It's a little hard to hear you.
All right. So Hemingway was a very controversial man. We see this in his writings about religion, women, politics, etc. In today's society, people have the tendency to be afraid to truly express themselves, if themselves means to be against the norm. And my question is, I have two questions. The first one is, what do you think the repercussions will be for future generations? And the second is, although we mean well as a society, aren't we, in a sense, killing future Hemingways?
Future Hemingways. Wow.
Well, Steve, you're recently retired from journalism, so from that
journalism was
perspective.
the practice that Gertrude Stein convinced Hemingway that he should get out of journalism and do real writing. And Hemingway at some point says, journalism was fine as long as you get out of it, before it ruins your brain. Unfortunately, I did not do that. I stayed in journalism far too long along that line, and consequently, I'm not a fiction writer. I don't write fiction. I've tried, and I'm not very good at it. There's the media landscape has changed so much. The writing world has changed so much. There's this great literary marketplace that's very global and is kind of exciting in a lot of ways. In the United States, even as the death of books, seems to be pronounced every other day, people still write them.
They're not dying.
And they're not dying. And every time I turn around, I used to be a book critic for a long time, and I used to be able to keep up, kind of with what was going on in the literary world. Today, not so much, but I do pay attention to the extent that there are a whole lot of people publishing first novels. There are a whole lot of global writers, immigrant writers writing from that experience, publishing in the United States today. That to me is really exciting. Yeah. And so I don't think they're necessarily being repressed because of that. I think in some ways they're being celebrated just because of the moment in time. And so I hope that answers your question, at least in part.
Hemingway, he was, he kind of faced some censorship from his publishers with, a farewell to arms. There were certain words they just didn't want to print, and he wanted to recreate like the authentic soldier talk, and that would not do for the readers of Scribner's and the magazines that his work was being serialized in, and So he faced a little bit of that too.
And of course, what we don't know is, there were very few gatekeepers back then, and primarily white men were going to get published, and Max Perkins would be the main gatekeeper in the sense for American literature. And so, in a change of your question is, were there other Hemingways that we never heard from because they didn't make it? But the danger of what we celebrate now, I'm struck by this, is that we're publishing more and more people of all sorts and novels of all sorts. But the audience is being fragmented in a way that anybody who read Hemingway back then because there were fewer books being published.
Of course.
So I kind of look at the literary scene as much like going to the Boston Commons and having 600 soapboxes in which everybody's talking to each other, but there's no one in the audience listening. So when you get rid of the gatekeepers and open up the floodgate, which is much more democratic and better, at the same time it makes it harder for some of these voices to emerge because of the cacophony of all of these many books. So it's a mixed blessing. But the thing about losing journalism is we still have journalism. It's changing. But the great gift of journalism to writers is that you have to write. You cannot not turn in a story, because a story a day late is a dead story. And I think you look at many novelists who are trained as journalists, they get over that business of a writer's block in a hurry because they have to turn out this copy. And that discipline of the tactile typing, getting the copy, and then having other people tear it apart is a useful training ground for people who want to write. And that hasn't changed. It's now being published in a different format. So I wouldn't be discouraged in that way.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. You mentioned that Hemingway, like his contemporaries in the 20s and 30s, was leftist-leaning, socialist, communist even.
Dos Passos was in the 20s. Hemingway doesn't make that move until 35 or so.
30, 35.
Yeah.
Well, I guess the question is sort of nature and nurture. Were his parents, were Hemingway's parents supportive of his political sympathies? Did they influence him in any way? The way
Influenced him,
Yeah.
Was he middle class? Was he poor? Was he upper middle class?
It was relatively middle class. His father was a family physician, not necessarily a wealthy
educated.
one. He was a scientist. He introduced Hemingway to the natural world, to the outdoors, to fishing, to hunting. I mean, it was that great of an influence. But he was also a very religious man, and I think that part of Hemingway, that part of his influence never really took with Hemingway, at least not overtly. Hemingway's mother, who was rather domineering.
I'm waiting to see how you're going to describe the mother.
Yeah, rather domineering. I think she contributed to Hemingway's stubbornness, his creative side. She wanted to be an opera singer. She ended up being a painter. She lived a pretty imperious life. And so in some ways she, as much as Hemingway might have acknowledged that he loved her, I mean, one of the things that took him to Kansas City was he wanted to get away from his family. He was ready to move on and to leave home and set his own path. And
you talked about, unlike some of the Harvard and Yale kids, he was a distinct minority. But did he have the financial wherewithal to go to Spain on his own? Did he learn how to drive a car? Did he come from an entitled family?
I don't read it that way, and
they weren't badly off.
Yeah,
he could have gone to college. It wasn't for financial reasons.
It was partly because his sister, who was a year older but had been held back. Ernest and Marceline graduated high school the very same year because she had been held back, and she was kind of given the nod to go to college. Although it's still unclear to me whether Hemingway could have. He talked about, the yearbook says he's going to go to the University of Illinois. In one letter he mentions, I'd like to go to Princeton. In another letter he said he's going out to live with an uncle in California, and then I'll come back and go to college.
So he took a gap year, huh?
Yeah, but so, and there was this episode, I know Verna knows I should mention, Verna is the author of a very fine one-volume biography that came out last year. So you ought to look at her book as well. But so she knows this very well. So the Hemingways had a summer cabin in Michigan, which of course is a sign of wealth, and they had it from the, essentially the year that Hemingway was born, and he spent every summer of his boyhood up in Michigan. Shortly after this year, but 1919, 1920, his mother wanted her own space. The cabin was kind of small, and it was a large family. It had been expanded over the years, but across the lake they had some farm acreage, and she built a cabin for herself where she could paint and be by herself or maybe with a friend. But Hemingway appears to have resented that and seemed to suggest, at least somewhere, that she sort of spent his college tuition on a cabin for herself. I mean, you might have a different perspective on that, but
I have a more sympathetic view of Grace than probably anybody, and I see her as a real positive influence, that she did sort of follow her creative pursuits,
sure,
even when it wasn't necessarily what everybody around her wanted to do. She also dragged him to suffrage meetings, and the Hemingway family was conservative in a lot of ways, but they also made sure that he had a very broad education in music and art, and he was a journalist, so he was politically aware, and it's kind of hard to say. I kind of agree, though, that it really was later in Europe that he first saw more of a left-wing ideal, and then in the 30s that really started to like activate in him.
I mean, this is unscholarly and unscientific, and it's looking at my own experience, but I felt at age 18 he wanted to get out of there. It's not necessarily dislike of your parents, but you want to attain escape velocity, to use a 1960s space term.
And, if he's a genius, then Oak Park is too small.
No, and there's something driving him. The other thing is that Steve mentioned the father's dogmatic religious views. I think that's part of the reason why Hemingway was uninterested in dogmatic left-wing views. Dogma represented his dad. And so, every child who doesn't rebel still rebels in some way, and so that may have been it. But I think for sure he wanted to get out of Oak Park.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is an abrupt transition, but in Hemingway's early writing at the Toronto newspaper when he was a freelancer, he had an interesting sense of humor, a bit dry and droll. Did that get pushed out of him, worn down by war? Did he have it, but it was only in letters, but not in his writing? Could you address Hemingway's lost sense of humor?
Some of that Toronto journalism was very humorous. I mean, he had this voice that does show up in letters.
The scum of Greenwich Village.
Yeah, and it was a shtick in a lot of ways, because he was still a pretty young guy, and that was just a couple of years later. I think he held on to that maybe when he was writing for Esquire. It doesn't show up in it doesn't really show up in his writing or his fiction that often. He seems a little bit more sober at times, but I'm not a huge fan. I mean, at times it felt kind of juvenile, and I think maybe through the course of the 20s and into the 30s, I think he, and again, it was journalism, which he was trying to get out of. In the course of that period, I think. He was writing for pay.
No one really thinks of A Farewell to Arms as being a very funny book, but
there are moments.
It's got some Farewell to Arms. It's got some kind of funny lines, but they're the kind of, like, if you're a person with a sense of humor, you might be able to recognize that similar sense of humor in someone else. But some of Hemingway's funniest lines, you can also take them completely straight. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell.
And I think there's humor in the Toronto paper stuff that he wrote. I think you'd find a lot of evidence that. The other thing about him, and you just mentioned this about, he's very young. I mean, do I have the title right? Torrents of Spring.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a really juvenile attempt at lashing out at somebody. And so, you know, I think he's still finding his oats, or not his oats, but whatever it is he's going to do at this period. But he does use humor in the Toronto Star ones, but you have to look for them.
Do either of you make reference to the story Soldier's Home, where the protagonist is, of course, coming back from that First World War experience and then heading off to Kansas City?
Do you mention Soldier's Home in your book, the Harold Krebs story? I think.
Yeah, I do. I think, isn't that? Gosh,
One
this is
of
a
you-
problem having written a book 2 years ago.
I do. Partly because a lot of people think of it as the only piece of short fiction that's kind of about Oak Park. I mean, I think you have to be from Oak Park to think that.
That's right.
But it's a soldier who comes back to Oklahoma, and he's clearly shell-shocked in some ways, and he doesn't know what to do with his life, and he's being harangued by his mother to get a job, and he's sitting around the breakfast table reading the Kansas City Star, which happened to be the the important newspaper in the region. I think it's a great story, I talk about it briefly. I don't go into great detail.
Yeah, so buy his book, I doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the problem, and we're talking about changing histories and stuff, is that and I'll be curious to know if it's the same for you, our editors are demanding shorter books, shorter chapters, shorter chapterettes within books. And so our cutting rooms are filled with a lot of stuff. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing because, in a sense, gosh, this is ancient history, but you remember Clinton's campaign, Carville had on the wall in Little Rock, "It's the economy, stupid," and that made the message of it so good. And with today's reading patterns, having a more tightly woven story that uses only one little bit of evidence rather than overwhelming it may not necessarily be a bad thing. But that's in part the answer why sometimes when we're asked these questions, they're on the cutting room floor.
Well, I mentioned your appendix about the unknown Italian soldier. And Steve, at the end of your book, you sort of had this sort of last-minute discovery that's really exciting. You call it a coda, but...
Yeah, which I've taken a little bit farther even since. I wanted to start out earlier by giving great credit to this place and this Hemingway collection upstairs, which I first visited in 1999, which was this Hemingway centennial year, and I started doing research here, looking at that Kansas City period and other things. I began writing about Hemingway at that time. At that time, I met Michael Reynolds, who was a great scholar and had just finished his 5th volume of a long-running Hemingway biography. He came to Kansas City. I brought him to Kansas City to do a talk, and we had lunch a couple times, and I found an email or remembered for years how he suggested that I should look into Hemingway's grand jury appearance in Kansas City. Nobody's ever written about this. He'd never wrote about it, but somehow he had this hunch that Hemingway had testified before a grand jury. And Mike died within a year of that, and I regret that I was never able to tell him what I finally found 16 years later. He and I both went on the assumption that the grand jury had something to do with the writing that Hemingway was doing about the hospital, the general hospital, corruption, graft, mismanagement, and all this stuff. And I knew judges, I knew people in the prosecutor's office in Kansas City, and I made periodic runs hoping to get to grand jury records from the state court, and never able to turn anything up. A year ago, I turned my manuscript in to my editor, and I started doing some last-minute kind of poking around, and I made another run in the digital archive of the newspaper, and I found the story of a grand jury that met in late April of 1918. Hemingway was still in Kansas City, and it was a federal court case. And it was a federal court case involving a news story that Hemingway had actually covered. And I have this moment, and I went down to the National Archives. There was a regional center in Kansas City. I had the names of the 2 police officers who were indicted because a crazy story about them being at a drug house, and 2 federal agents come to this drug house and they start shooting at each other, and one of the federal agents is wounded and taken to the hospital. And out of this experience, there's a lot of backstory that I'm not even sure I totally understand. I read, so I go to the National Archives, they have the names of these police officers, and lo and behold, the archivist brings this stack of folded papers, and here is the court case. And it's interesting. I learned some stuff. I make some copies of the test, the depositions. I learned a little bit more about what went on. It's still kind of confusing. And as I'm folding the last thing back up, I see something on the back of this document, and it's a list of witnesses. And of course, Hemingway's name is on this list of witnesses, as is another, the police reporter for the Star. And so I had a hallelujah moment in the archives in Kansas City. I went home. I immediately wrote like a 1,200-word coda that I sent to my editor and said, hey, can we tack this onto my book? And that was that until last spring, while the book is done and it's in galleys already and I can't do anything about it, I was here, spent a few hours here upstairs in the research room, and I started looking at some things that I'd never looked at before. And I looked at I asked for a box that had some other material or miscellaneous material, and I'm going through it, looking at one thing or another, nothing much that interests me. And there was one file folder that had on the tab court. And I pull it out and I open it up. It's the subpoena from a federal court judge in Kansas City to E.M. Hemingway, which I finally realized Mike Reynolds, who was a great reporter and biographer, must have seen that paper and had never been able to confirm it. And it just, I wrote a piece just last month for the Kansas City Star about this discovery and the second level of the discovery. And it made me realize Mike Reynolds looked at every single piece of paper in the archives and archives elsewhere, and he just knew that. He didn't tell me he saw that, but I just assumed he'd seen that. Of course, I wish I'd seen that piece of paper 10 or 12 years ago, but it makes for a good story now, and it just furthers the coda. Anyway, thanks for asking about that. But as Jamie well knows, I mean, the work of biographers is never done. I mean, you can keep going forever. I'm not sure to what purpose, at least in my world, but.
It's what he describes is really our daily life, in the sense that if you like to fish and fish with a bobber, the life of a biographer of our type is we spend days watching the flat lake surface, waiting for a bobber to bob up and down. You go through hundreds of boxes, and then you have a moment, and that's why occasionally archivists have heart attacks, because if you go upstairs, it's and suddenly somebody goes, "Oh my God!" Because they have found Hemingway's name. So that happens to us every once in a while, and then we get shushed. But anyway. But it does prove that when it comes to Hemingway, all roads do lead to Kansas City, and you're really onto something. Appreciate it.
I wanted to end our session by sharing a passage from a letter written by Ernest Hemingway to his sister on a very significant date, November 11th, 1918. He writes, "I want to see some of Italy and Austria now, as I'll not be back for several years, because about next fall, I am going to commence the real war again, the war to make the world safe for Ernie Hemingway, and I plan to knock him for a loop and will be a busy man for several years." Thank you for coming.
It's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.